"Move out of the way, old man!" The voice cut through the air like a blade, and before anyone could react, a sharp shove sent him stumbling forward. His worn leather bag crashed to the floor, scattering papers across the station. Gasps rippled through the crowd, their voices tightening into uneasy whispers. The man's shoulders hunched, his age visible in the lines of his posture, but he did not fall. He steadied himself, hand trembling slightly as he reached for his belongings. Around him, no one stepped forward. The crowd clung to their places, some shaking their heads, others pretending not to notice. The aggressor smirked, adjusting his sleek suit as if violence were nothing more than an afterthought. His mutter came low, meant to sting. "Should have stayed out of the way. People like you are always dragging things down." No one answered him. Only the sound of a train rumbling in the distance filled the silence, heavy with the weight of complicity. The old man gathered his scattered papers with deliberate calm, fingers brushing each page as if reclaiming more than paper, as if reclaiming his dignity. But the silence from the crowd cut deeper than the shove itself. And yet, he remained upright, his presence quiet but unbroken, even as the insult hung in the air, unanswered. The edge of the platform loomed closer than anyone wanted to admit. His feet had skidded dangerously near it in the shove's aftermath, and for a heartbeat the entire station seemed to hold its breath. A single misstep and the story could have ended in tragedy. But he caught himself, one hand stretched outward, steadying against the cold rail. The aggressor gave a mocking laugh, the kind of laugh designed to humiliate rather than entertain. "Careful there, Grandpa. Don't want you falling where you don't belong." No one moved, not a single outstretched hand. Their eyes widened, their mouths stayed shut, and the moment of danger dissolved into quiet shame. The man lifted himself fully upright, his breath measured, his dignity intact despite the way his heart pounded in his chest. He turned slightly, scanning the crowd, seeing faces filled with pity, fear, and something worse, indifference. The train screeched as it slowed into the station, but its arrival only deepened the weight of the silence. The crowd had chosen to watch, not act. And in that decision, their silence said more than words ever could. The glow of phone screens lit the scene brighter than compassion ever did. Hands rose, recording every detail, framing humiliation for digital consumption. A whisper cut through the stillness. "Is he okay?" But it came with no action, no step forward. Another voice followed, hushed and sharp. "Don't get involved. Just let it play out." The phrase echoed in the space, proof of how silence can disguise itself as safety. The aggressor noticed the cameras and straightened, smirking wider, feeding off the spotlight. To him, the old man wasn't a victim. He was a prop for cruelty, a chance to perform dominance, and still, no one interfered. The crowd had traded humanity for footage, choosing clicks over courage. "Always thinking you own the space," the aggressor muttered, loud enough for the nearest roused to hear. His words dripped with venom, casual yet deliberate, spoken with the confidence of someone who expected no consequence. He stepped closer, puffing his chest, letting the insult hang in the air like smoke. "People like you never learn, do you?" The old man's jaw tightened, but his lips remained sealed. His silence was not submission, it was restraint. The aggressor mistook it for weakness, chuckling under his breath, savoring the moment. A commuter coughed nervously, shifting uneasily. Another lowered her eyes, unwilling to be seen witnessing hate. In their silence, the aggressor found fuel. He wanted not only to wound, but to make the crowd complicit. His sneer lingered, his voice cutting sharper with each word. Racism was not just in his tone, it was in the ease with which he displayed it. Certain no one would stop him, the man stood slightly hunched, his face half obscured by the brim of his hat, but the quiet in his eyes carried more strength than shouting ever could. His calm unnerved the aggressor, though he would never admit it. Pain flickered there, an ache born not just from the shove, but from years of knowing how swiftly humanity can vanish in moments like this. And yet he refused to break. His hands stayed steady, his voice withheld, his dignity guarded like treasure. To those watching, he seemed small in stature but vast in presence, a figure who absorbed cruelty without letting it define him. His silence carried more weight than the aggressor's sneer ever could. Finally, their eyes met. A stare without words, heavy enough to still the air around them. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing a storm brewing in silence. Neither man moved, but the tension held, a promise that this confrontation was only beginning and no one could look away. "Ticket, please." The voice of the attendant was brisk, routine. He nodded, handed it over, and moved on. His shoes clicked softly against the station floor, merging with the steady hum of footsteps all around him. To the crowd, he was no different than any other commuter, just another figure among the rush of briefcases, backpacks, and coffee cups. Nobody turned twice to notice him. Nobody paused to recognize the man who had walked through history, whose voice had once inspired millions. And maybe that was the point. Stripped of titles and applause, he was left with the same fragile armor as anyone else, the hope to pass through this day without insult, without the weight of prejudice pressing down. There was irony in the anonymity. For decades, his name had filled theaters, his face stretched across screens, his words carried in classrooms. Yet here, in this ordinary station, none of it mattered. Not the awards, not the legacy, not the millions who admired him. Racism never paused to ask about achievement. It only saw what it wanted to dismiss. To the hurried stranger brushing past, he was simply an aging black man moving too slowly. He carried his history quietly, unannounced, proving that no level of success could shield anyone from the sting of disregard. As he walked, the rhythm of the station echoed memories he could never quite shake. Times when doors closed before he even reached them. Times when his presence was questioned more than his words. He thought of the insults delivered with casual cruelty, of the countless moments when silence was more painful than slurs. Yet he also remembered standing tall through it all, meeting hatred with dignity, answering bitterness with calm. "You endure," he murmured to himself too softly for anyone to hear. The lines etched across his face weren't just signs of age. They were a record of resilience, a testament to surviving what was meant to break him. He noticed the subtleties others ignored. The slight shuffle of a woman pulling her purse closer as he walked by. The sidelong glance from a man pretending not to stare. Even in a sea of diversity, invisible barriers remained. Each commuter carried their own assumptions, their own quiet judgments, and those judgments drew invisible lines through the crowd. It wasn't open hostility. It was something quieter, almost rehearsed. The polite avoidance, the calculated distance, he saw it all, not with anger, but with weary recognition, knowing these small cuts were part of a larger wound society still refused to heal. He paused briefly, letting the current of people flow past. Injustice doesn't ask who you are, he thought. It doesn't care about fame or obscurity. It strikes where it can, against anyone, anywhere. The truth weighed heavily. Prejudice was never selective. And in that knowledge, he knew this day, like so many before, would carry its own test. "Out of my way," the sharp voice cut through the noise. A younger man in a crisp suit pushed forward, his polished shoes clicking like they owned the ground beneath him. His movements were calculated, full of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He carried himself as if the station was his alone, his entitlement spilling over into every glance, every impatient sigh. People noticed, but nobody challenged him. His presence was sharp, invasive, demanding space where none was freely given. The older man in his path felt the shift in air, the sudden claim of authority by someone who hadn't earned it. He recognized the type instantly, not just impatient, but entitled. A man who believed respect was owed only upward, never across. The arrogance didn't need words yet. It radiated in posture, in presence, in the certainty that others would move before he had to. "Typical," the man in the suit muttered, loud enough to sting. His words slipped out like venom, an insult tied to skin, not to pace. It was quick, tossed under his breath, but its weight landed heavy. The kind of slur meant to diminish, meant to cut without consequence. The older man heard it, as did a few nearby, though most pretended not to. That's how racism often traveled. Not shouted, but whispered, lingering in the air, just enough to remind someone where they were expected to stand. The insult wasn't new. It was the same old story, dressed in a new suit. The younger man's smirk followed as if he had won something in speaking cruelty out loud. He brushed past, clearly convinced the world would bend to his pace, his privilege, his voice. The protagonist inhaled deeply, refusing to bite back, though the silence wasn't weakness. It was a choice. Yet choice didn't dull the wound. It burned quietly, echoing not just in his ears, but in every memory where that word, or one like it, had been thrown as casually as breath. The man in the suit turned his head just enough to glance back, an eye roll sharp enough to slice. His face carried a smirk, the kind that said, "You don't matter here." Without hesitation, he slid ahead in line, his briefcase swinging as if the space belonged to him alone. To him, the older man wasn't a person, he was an obstacle, something to be brushed aside, dismissed without thought. The protagonist caught the look. The deliberate gesture of superiority, the exaggerated sigh meant to belittle. It wasn't just about getting ahead. It was about establishing dominance, as if one life's value outweighed another's. Around them, the crowd shifted slightly, no one saying a word. That was the cruelty of prejudice. Sometimes it spoke in silence, in the quiet approval of those who chose not to see. The older man didn't answer with anger. He stood there watching, his breathing steady, his gaze unbroken. Every insult, every gesture was a test, and he had spent a lifetime taking them. Reacting would only feed the arrogance standing before him. So he chose calm. But calm was not the absence of feeling. Inside, the sting of disrespect cut deep. His silence wasn't surrender, it was resistance in its own way. He would not lower himself to the same cruelty. "Not worth it," he whispered to himself, almost inaudible. His restraint contrasted sharply with the younger man's hostility, turning the aggressor's loud contempt into something smaller, more desperate. The dignity he carried wasn't loud, but it filled the space all the same. Some noticed the difference, though few would admit it. Dignity had a power arrogance could never fully erase. Whispers stirred among those nearby. A few commuters glanced sideways, their expressions tight with unease. Some seemed uncomfortable, shifting on their feet, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Others smirked faintly, entertained by the spectacle of conflict without consequence. The divide was clear, those who recognized injustice but stayed quiet, and those who found it easier to ignore. Nobody spoke up. Nobody intervened. The silence from the crowd was its own betrayal, feeding the aggressor's confidence. The older man noticed, not with surprise, but with a heaviness that settled deeper in his chest. The imbalance of power was suddenly visible to all. With a quiet sigh, he shifted just enough to let the suited man surge ahead. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime of slights. To step aside wasn't submission, it was survival. But even survival came with the bitter taste of being disregarded. "Move!" The barked command came with force. The younger man in the press suit didn't wait for space. He created it with both hands, shoving the older man hard to the side. The impact sent him stumbling, his balance nearly gone as the crowd gasped in collective shock. The strike wasn't just physical, it was loaded with intent. The kind of aggression designed to announce power and strip another of it. The sound of shoes scraping the floor, the sharp intake of breath from bystanders. It all played out in a heartbeat. "Watch where you're going." "Old man," the aggressor added, his voice sharp, confident, cruel. The protagonist steadied himself, one hand against the railing, his chest tightening not from the fall but from the humiliation of being manhandled like a nuisance. Around him, the reaction was fragmented, gasps, murmurs, but no one stepped forward. Their eyes told the story, concern without action, sympathy without courage. The younger man adjusted his tie as if nothing had happened, sliding into the boarding line with satisfaction. It wasn't about moving forward. It was about pushing someone else back. The violence was casual, the arrogance rehearsed, the entitlement absolute. The protagonist straightened, though slower now, the sting not in his body but in the cruel reminder that dignity could be tossed aside as quickly as a shove. The shove had consequences. His bag slipped from his grip, striking the floor with a hollow thud. It burst open, spilling its contents like a wound torn wide. Papers fluttered, a pen rolled beneath someone's shoe, and his carefully folded ticket skidded across the platform, caught just beyond reach. For a moment, time froze. The crowd watched as he bent slowly, his joints protesting, gathering the fragments of his life from the floor. Each item felt heavier than it was. A newspaper folded neatly earlier that morning, a book dog-eared at his favorite passage, loose change that scattered into corners. The indignity wasn't just in the fall of objects, but in the exposure of vulnerability. The station buzzed with energy, but here, in this circle of disruption, silence hung thick. Nobody bent to help. Not one hand extended to ease his struggle. The antagonist smirked, eyes locked on the scattered belongings as if they confirmed his point. Disorder as proof of inferiority. The protagonist knelt, fingers trembling slightly as he retrieved each item, his body folding under the weight of humiliation far greater than the bag itself. "Man-like, you should know your place." The words cut louder than the shove. The younger man's voice carried over the platform, sharp enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't muttered now. It was declared, weaponized for an audience. His mockery wasn't just aimed at the older man. It was meant to entertain, to reinforce invisible hierarchies. "You think the world waits for you? Get real." His laughter followed, dry and hollow. The kind of sound that invited complicity from anyone willing to chuckle along. The protagonist froze, still crouched, his fingers brushing the corner of his ticket. He looked up, his eyes steady despite the ache in his chest. For a split second, their gazes met, arrogance staring down resilience. He wanted to answer, but the weight of years pressed against his tongue. Words had been used against him for so long that silence often felt stronger. Yet silence came at a cost. It gave cruelty room to echo unchecked. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, the phrase, "know your place," lodging itself in their ears like poison. Some smiled faintly, not at him, but at the drama unfolding in real time. The stage was set and humiliation became the act. Screens lit up one after another. A handful of commuters raised their phones, recording quietly, eager to capture spectacle without confronting it. Others whispered, their eyes darting between the aggressor and the fallen man, careful not to be noticed. The hypocrisy was sharp. A dozen lenses fixed on injustice, yet no voice raised to stop it. The power of social media felt hollow here. Proof without protection, exposure without intervention. The protagonist caught a glimpse of his reflection in a passing phone screen. He wasn't seen as a man in pain, but as content, as a clip for strangers to consume later. His humanity was blurred into entertainment. The laughter of the younger man grew louder in contrast, feeding off the passivity around him. In that moment, the silence of the bystanders was louder than the mockery itself. Not one face in the crowd showed recognition. He was Morgan Freeman, an icon, a man whose voice had narrated resilience, struggle, and hope. Yet here he was invisible. Status vanished under skin, under age, under assumption. To them, he was just another elderly black man being pushed aside. The irony stung. Fame filled theaters, won awards, inspired millions. But prejudice stripped all of that away in seconds. His ticket lay in his hand now, retrieved but crumpled, much like the dignity it represented. The world saw what it wanted, and in that moment they chose to see less. The younger man leaned closer, whispering sharply, "Nobody even knows you." That says it all. The protagonist's lips pressed into a firm line, not from agreement, but from the heavy truth that recognition alone could never shield him from racism. The temptation to shout back burned in his chest, but he resisted. He had lived long enough to know that fury would only feed the fire. So he stood tall, composed, eyes unblinking. His silence wasn't weakness, it was defiance. Yet to those watching, it looked like surrender. They mistook dignity for fragility, restraint for powerlessness. Inside, however, the silence roared. Every insult, every dismissal, every slight carried the weight of years lived in the shadow of racism. His eyes betrayed the ache, though his lips stayed closed. The aggressor sneered, misreading composure as victory. "That's what I thought," he muttered. brushing past with smug satisfaction. But the protagonist remained rooted, a quiet storm inside, choosing not to break before those eager to see him fall. The real betrayal wasn't the shove or the insult, it was the silence. 100 eyes had witnessed injustice, yet no one spoke, no one intervened. Racism thrives not only in the cruelty of aggressors, but in the passivity of witnesses. Every whispered laugh, every averted gaze, every phone lifted instead of a hand, all of it compounded the humiliation. The older man carried the weight of their failure as much as the shove itself. He stood, belongings clutched to his chest, surrounded by people yet utterly alone, bearing the truth that silence can wound deeper than words. "Wait, isn't that Morgan Freeman?" The words cracked through the silence like a stone thrown into still water. Heads turned, eyes widened, and for the first time, the weight of what had just happened began to shift. Recognition carried power, and suddenly the man dismissed as invisible was seen. The voice had come from a young woman near the back, her tone trembling between disbelief and shame. She didn't just recognize his face, she recognized the injustice unfolding before her. Whispers spread quickly, each one a thread pulling at the fabric of silence. The antagonist stiffened, his smirk faltering as the realization sank in. The man he had shoved, mocked, and humiliated wasn't some nameless stranger. The older man didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone began to grow heavier in the air, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped moments earlier. For the first time, the aggressor's confidence was challenged not by resistance, but by recognition. The shift had begun, quiet but undeniable. "Morgan Freeman? No way! That's him. It is him. I can't believe this happened to him." The murmurs swelled into exclamations, the energy of the crowd changing shape. Where there had been indifference, now there was awe. Where there had been silence, now voices rose in disbelief. The station felt charged, as though everyone suddenly carried a responsibility they had ignored only moments ago. People who had looked away now leaned forward, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. The aggressor shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, but the weight of eyes pressing against him grew heavier by the second. What had been entertainment for some was now transforming into outrage. Recognition wasn't just about fame, it was a reminder that prejudice spares no one, not even the icons who had given so much to culture and history. Phones tilted forward, lenses sharpening their focus. Live streams lit up across platforms, captions exploding. "Morgan Freeman disrespected on train platform." Views climbed rapidly, comments pouring in, demanding accountability, condemning silence, and naming racism for what it was. Suddenly, the injustice wasn't confined to one platform. It was global. Every second captured, every insult immortalized. The world outside was no longer blind to what had happened. The protagonist stood still, his silence commanding more attention than any outburst could. His calm became the center of the storm, a striking contrast to the aggressor's crumbling facade. The crowd knew they weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants in a moment that could no longer be ignored. The man in the suit, once so smug, faltered. His jaw tightened as the recognition spread. His smirk flickered, unable to hold against the glare of dozens of eyes, now filled with judgment rather than amusement. What are you all staring at?" His words lacked the sharpness of before, carrying instead a nervous edge. The laughter he had once demanded no longer came. The platform had turned cold against him. Every step backward exposed his arrogance as fragile, his authority as hollow. The crowd wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were turning against him. His earlier bravado shrank under the pressure of accountability. Confidence cracked, not with a scream, but with silence, the kind that made him suddenly small. Finally, Morgan Freeman spoke. His voice, low and steady, carried farther than the aggressor's shouting ever had. "Respect," he said, pausing long enough for the word to settle, "should not depend on recognition. It should exist for everyone." The platform grew still. Phones lowered slightly, attention now fixed not on the spectacle but on the substance. His words weren't for the man who shoved him alone. They were for everyone present, and for everyone watching beyond the screens. "I shouldn't have to be Morgan Freeman to be treated with decency," he continued, his tone deliberate, unwavering. "No one should." The crowd leaned closer, drawn by the weight of truth. It wasn't anger that commanded them, it was clarity. His voice carried the authority of lived experience, the kind that transcended celebrity. The aggressor swallowed hard, caught in the echo of words that stripped him bare. Voices began to rise, this time not against Freeman, but against the man who shoved him. "Apologize," someone demanded. "That was racist," another said firmly. "Unacceptable," echoed a third. A few stepped forward, helping Freeman gather what remained of his belongings, restoring what had been scattered. The energy had shifted entirely. Where moments earlier silence reigned, now moral courage took root. It wasn't just about defending a famous actor, it was about reclaiming dignity for anyone who had ever been diminished. The aggressor's smirk collapsed into something closer to panic. His eyes darted across the crowd, desperate for support that no longer existed. His once confident posture sagged under the weight of judgment. For the first time, he understood. This moment was no longer his to control. "Sir, step aside." Transit security arrived swiftly, their presence slicing through the tension. The suited man who had mocked so loudly just minutes earlier now found himself surrounded, his swagger drained into stammered excuses. "You don't understand, he was in the way," he muttered, voice trembling. But the crowd's eyes bore into him. The very people who once stayed silent now testified, their words piling against him like a tide he couldn't outrun. Security escorted him away. Each step of his retreat met with the bitter taste of public humiliation. His downfall was as visible as his cruelty had been. All eyes turned back to Freeman. But he didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, he stood straight, his calm presence louder than any insult hurled earlier. One man whispered, "How does he stay so composed?" "Because real strength doesn't come from anger, it comes from restraint." His silence was not weakness. It was proof that dignity has more power than cruelty ever could. The lesson lingered, heavier than the shove that started it all. By nightfall, the moment was everywhere. Clips replayed across Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, each one fueling outrage. Headlines screamed about racism, injustice, and respect. Millions watched in disbelief. How could someone like him, Morgan Freeman, be treated this way? But beneath the shock was something deeper, the realization that it wasn't about celebrity. It was about the reality countless others faced daily, without cameras to bear witness. What had begun as humiliation turned into a viral story of resilience and truth. The world responded. Civil rights leaders condemned the act. Activists shared the footage as a call to action. Ordinary people flooded comment sections with anger, support, and reflection. "This isn't about one man," one post read. "This is about all of us." From city streets to living rooms, conversations sparked. The story wasn't just Freeman's anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed silence in the face of racism was no longer an option. Freeman's closing words echoed far beyond the station. "Injustice anywhere isn't just about who it happens to. It's about who stands by and lets it happen." The message became the heartbeat of the story, a reminder that silence is complicity, and respect should never depend on recognition. The lesson wasn't about him. It was about us all. The narrator's voice breaks through the weight of the story. "What would you have done if you were standing there, spoken out, or stayed silent?" Because racism isn't just about the act itself, but about those who choose silence. Your voice matters here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you do, how you feel, and why speaking up against injustice is never optional. Don't let this moment fade. Subscribe, join the dialogue, and help keep the conversation alive, because the fight against everyday racism needs every voice, and silence only strengthens injustice.